to areas further into Gaza where it is most needed because the humanitarian convoys have come under attack. All of this comes as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces growing pressure as the war in Gaza continues. I do want to bring in Tawfiq Rahim, who is the principal with 2040 Advisory, to talk more about the very latest developments. Tawfiq, thank you for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
There has been a lot of controversy surrounding the temporary floating pier off the Gaza coast. A lot of questions as to how that aid was even supposed to get into the hands of the Palestinian civilians. Now that it had come to light that the U.S. may not reinstall it, what is the potential impact of that?
Well, I think the pier from the outset was really a make-believe idea. It was much more about the pageantry of action than it was about effective aid delivery. Obviously, there were hopes and, aspirations for the humanitarian community that they could leverage this pier, but it was always considered a little bit of a white elephant and a Hail Mary attempt, obviously in a very difficult circumstance. So there's very little incentive to revisit it and rebuild it. And that's beyond the weakness of the infrastructure itself, as you mentioned, that suffered under the weather conditions. So there has to be other pathways found now that the pier is kind of out of the picture. And I think people will return to efforts that were already being made at that time for aid delivery through other mechanisms and the support of countries in the region.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been facing growing pressure from a number of factions as well as a number of countries. And I did want to ask you this because also on Tuesday, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that the state has to begin drafting ultra-Orthodox Jews into the military, which is something that basically ends a decades-old system that granted them exemption. What is the potential impact on that? Earlier, we were sharing with our viewers a live protest from Jerusalem with ultra-Orthodox Jewish men who are very upset by this decision.
Well, the political context within Israel is becoming increasingly volatile. And even more so than October 6th, when it was at its height just before the October 7th attacks. And it's bringing into a lot of forces, the Orthodox, Jewish members of society who may be drafted now into the army, but then also people who are protesting and Benjamin Netanyahu's actions, especially after the withdrawal of Benny Gantz from the war cabinet. And so you have kind of renewed political winds agitating from multiple directions against the Netanyahu government. And it actually means that the situation in Gaza, in some ways, is taking a backseat domestically inside Israel.
Let's also talk about the growing divide between the United States and Israel. We have seen this with the words and the actions with the Biden administration and with Netanyahu's war cabinet. Talk to us about that divide. Is it what it seems to be?
I think it isn't, partially because of the elections coming up on November 5th. And it's very hard for the current administration to move very sharply against Israel. Obviously, there's significant frustration because they haven't been able to make momentum. And there's frustration on the Israeli side because the United States has not been able to deliver results in their conversations with Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt to create a deal with Hamas. But I think there's going to be long-term implications in terms of coordination with Israel. And whatever side wins on November 5th, I think that's going to stay. I don't think there's any love lost between either of the sides and Netanyahu. But, what's remarkable is that in the last 8 months, and I've written a book on the crisis, Middle Eastern crisis and conflict, where I go through all the players and the different situations. The crisis has been kind of frozen for the last 8 months. And I think the blame game is going to start coming out in the next 2 months of who's responsible. Is it Netanyahu's the United States? And so there may be increased finger pointing, but I think it'll get sucked into the media cycle around the U.S. elections and now the Israeli domestic scene rather than about the crisis itself. And that will dictate how the parties respond.
I do also want to speak with you about the increase in attacks between Israel and Hezbollah. Right now,
Mhm.
initially, the war was on one front, and it was between Israel and Hamas. We have then seen Iran backed proxies making bolder moves, and Iran itself. Now we've seen conflict ramp up between Israel and Hezbollah. What can you share with our viewers about the concerns on that front?
Well, it's very interesting because people in Lebanon are still flying in for the summer, and that's the typical tradition. There's more Lebanese living outside of Lebanon than in Lebanon itself. So it has not deterred some of that movement, even though the threat is very real. I think both sides, while they see the brinkmanship, feel that the costs are too high for either Israel or Hezbollah to engage in a full-scale conflict. If that does occur, and it could because of an errant missile or a rocket strike, and the tensions just ratchet up, particularly in Israel. If there's casualties, they might need to retaliate against Hezbollah positions. It's not the same as a conflict with Hamas. Hezbollah has very significant capabilities, both in terms of its surveillance of targets and its ability to reach those targets, as well as a ground fighting force should there be any type of ground incursion. And already the north of Israel is largely displaced. And so domestically, politically, it would be devastating for the Netanyahu government if war unfolded with Lebanon. And very, very quickly, it would lead to a point where I think Israel would need to actually ramp down that conflict very quickly. So the United States, though, to be perfectly honest, has not been as forthright in tamping down tensions. And so those tensions remain between the two sides.
There's a lot going on a variety of fronts, Tofik. Anything else that you are really just keeping a very close eye on, or any concerns on your end as it relates to everything that is going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think, Israel has had significant support from the United States until now, and Europe and the Gulf countries, because they were pursuing closer relationships with Israel prior to October 7th, were willing to maintain the relationships they had established through the Abraham Accords. I think as this conflict goes into the summer, there's a lot more trepidation, and Israel could cross a point of no return where, for example, Saudi Arabia starts to move in another direction, starts to avoid the concept of normalization they were looking to. And the sides on Palestine, you could end up having further radicalization, even a fall of the government of the Palestinian Authority, which Israel objects to. So I think there's a challenge right now for Israel that it may not like the situation, but it could actually get significantly worse should this conflict continue. And I think that's the biggest risk people should be paying attention to, that making a deal now is the right move. Waiting 2 months from now, the same deal may not be on the table.
All right, Tofik, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.